Okay, let's talk about portrait photography, shooting people as your subject. There's three broad categories of photography: art photography, public relations photography that includes advertising, and photojournalism. What do you think the goal of all three of those is? What's the role of a photograph in art, in public relations, and in photojournalism? To make an impression on the viewer. I like the word impression. Think of putting your fist into a lump of raw clay and leaving that impression behind. As an artist, you want to make an impression. Advertising wants to make an impression, and photojournalists wants to make an impression on the viewer. Photography as art acknowledges the subjective nature of photography. The photograph is a canvas, and the image that the artist has is what goes onto the canvas. The image is subordinate to the artistic vision of the artist. Here's a picture that I made. As an artist, I had the vision. I put it out there. Does it make an impression? I'm hoping that it does. It doesn't impress everybody, but maybe some people are impressed by it. But the image is subordinate to what I envisioned. In public relations, there's a quality imposed onto the photograph for the benefit of a client. The client says, I want this kind of a picture. There's art involved. Certainly the photographer can bring art to it, and they need to be artful. But the client says, in the end, this is the photograph that we want to run. So the image is subordinate to the client or the product. You have to make great pictures of coffee makers. In photojournalism, the photograph is like a scientific record. You're supposed to just write down what you see as a scientist. You don't lead the witness. You don't tamper with the evidence. In photojournalism, truth and objectivity are the goals. So in the three broad categories of photography, art, advertising, photojournalism, in which category does portraiture fit? Think about this as we look at the rest of this presentation. Photography revolutionized portraiture. It was that back in the days, wealthy patrons would commission their portraits to be made, and they used to be life-size or even bigger. But along came photography, and everybody wanted their picture taken. They might pay as much as a month's salary to get their picture made. That's because a photographer had only certain days to work on. Notice these studios, they're all lit by natural light. If the light wasn't there, it was a cloudy day, they wouldn't be working. So they had to charge a lot when they did work. Notice the shades that are covering the light if it was too bright. Also, the image on the right, the photographer, it's a self-portrait of the photographer. He's looking into a mirror, the camera's pointed at the mirror. He sees in the viewfinder what you see on the left there, the upside down and backwards image. Today we take for granted that we put a 35mm SLR to our eye, everything's right side up and properly adjusted left to right. Photography was kind of a different world back then. Notice the bracket to hold the head still during long exposure. So what does portraiture do now that we can all afford it and see it all the time? Well, it reveals things. It reveals relationships. If there are more than one person in the photograph, a relationship is set up. You can see motherhood, sisters, workplace. Here's The Good Old Boys by Gordon Parks. Here's a grandfather with his grandchildren all around him. He's profiled. He's moved a little bit during the long exposure, so he's kind of blurry. But all the rest had to hold their pose for a long time. And it's all shot under natural light. Portraiture can reveal relationships to the things we enjoy. What can you say about the man with his car? You can at least say that he likes his car. He's proud of it. He enjoys it. It can reveal relationships to the spaces that we're in, the space that surrounds us. So portraiture reveals a bit about who we are and what we like to do. It can reveal character and personality by expression. The expression on the faces, the expression in the places that people are. The poses that people take are expressive. The interactions that go on in a photograph. This is the royal couple, their announced engagement photograph. Gestures are expressive. So what does a portrait photographer do? Well, a good portrait photographer must capture the expressive qualities inherent in the subject and in the surroundings. The photographer looks at the faces, the places, the poses, the interactions and gestures. These are all inherent in the subject. The little girl in this photograph brought her little chubby cheeks and her chubby arms and the wonder that's in her eye as she looks out the window. The photographer had to catch that moment. Here's a little girl. Anybody know who she is? Recognize her? That's Alice Little, Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. He posed kids in those kind of amusing ways. The kids brought their faces, the inherent qualities, their little personalities, and Lewis Carroll would capture that, the inherent qualities of the child and the surroundings. But a portrait photographer often adds appropriate expressive qualities through the lighting that's chosen, the camera angle, the cropping. Here's the idea of camera angles. The girl in the photograph on the right didn't bring that. She brought her face and her hair and her eye color and all that. The photographer just chose that camera angle. The photographer also decides to work with scale and lines, contrasts. All the things we talked about in composition are at the photographer's beck and call. But the sitter, the portrait sitter, has inherent qualities that also need to be captured and used. So let's look at this picture. Very expressive, right? So the photographer captured the expressive qualities inherent in the subject and in the surroundings. How did the photographer do that? What's inherent to the child that the photographer captured? The expression on the face. If the child were crying its head off, his head off rather, the photographer wouldn't have captured that. So the child had to bring something. The child brings this expression. The photographer captures it at the right moment. But what about adding appropriate expressive qualities to this image? What did the photographer do to make this picture what it is? How about the lighting, the contrast in lighting, the way it tapers off? How about the camera angle? How about the movement of the eye, the child being on a diagonal from bottom left to top right? The compositional ideas. What about the fact that it's cut into a square? The photographer chose to do that. These are all compositional ideas. And finally, the fact that the image is in black and white. This again, the photographer decided to be expressive about. It's their idea. The child's not black and white. Of course, by now you know that photography is all about light. So lighting is something to consider in portrait photography. It can be revealing and expressive. Lighting can be taken to extremes. This idea of silhouettes was all the rage back in George Washington's days. People wore cameos that were silhouettes of people. So there's two types of portrait photography. An example of each is shown here. Compare and contrast these two photographs. What are the differences? Well, Michelle Obama is in a more or less recognizable place, but it isn't important to the photograph. It doesn't really tell more about her. Whereas the woman who has skulls surrounding her and a skeleton, there's more about her in that photograph. She's in an environmental portrait photograph, kind of a documentary. It tells more about who she is, what she likes to do. So environmental portraits are portraits of people in their environment, and it reveals insight about the person. Something about the person is revealed in the photograph. What could you say about the guy who's sitting at his computer? He's got 3 yellow pads. He's got his t-shirt on. You could probably say he works at home. Maybe he's a writer. How about the guy on the right? Maybe he's a lawyer, a librarian. He's got the books there. So there's specific environment or artifacts that tell a little bit more about what the person is or does or likes to do. What could you say about the guy in front of the chess set? You could at least say that he likes chess. Naturally, there's a fireman in the middle, and there's an artist. She's got the paint tubes in front of her and canvases all around her. But I think the picture would be a lot stronger if she were holding a paintbrush. It would come across quicker. Some people wouldn't recognize those paint tubes necessarily right away. So environmental portraits are often taken in action, the person actually doing what they're about. Here's the rhythm section setting up the beat in a song, the bass and the drums. Baseball cards are all about the inaction. Here's the Derek Jeter card. Notice anything strange about it? There's George W. and Mickey Mantle. They were photoshopped into this baseball card. Look it up on eBay. Formal portraits are headshots. They're the person in the camera, the lighting. They're the traditional portraits. You could say that the woman is holding an artifact. It tells that she's a mom, at least. But otherwise, the other two people are anonymous to us. We're not quite sure who they are, unless they're very famous and everybody knows their face. So formal are usually made in a studio where you can control the lighting in the background. Backgrounds are typically neutral. A paper roll is often in a portrait studio. It comes down off the ceiling and people simply step in front of it or step onto it. Here's a paper roll. Notice that the light tapers off to make the gradation behind her. Otherwise, the paper roll is one solid color. Curtains are used in a studio as a backdrop. Here's a creative use of curtains as a backdrop. But notice the photographer's fingerprints all over this photograph. The fact that it's black and white. This kind of a sense of humor that the photographer has. That it's all about wrinkles. Maybe it's not so humorous, but that seems to be the story in this photograph. Formal can be done outside, but you don't have as much control over the lighting in the background. A moment later, the sun goes down and you're done shooting outside unless you bring in lights. Location shots are often shot as informal portraits. They're not quite environmental. They don't say a lot about the person. They just say that the woman on the right is inside looking out. Fashion shots are often on location. Somebody in a fairly recognizable place, but doesn't say much about them. So we look at what they're wearing and the expression on their face, the poses that they've taken. The things around them might say something, but more often than not, it really doesn't in the fashion shot. In advertising, the portrait is of a character. The Marlboro Man was created for the advertising campaign. Celebrities often take roles in advertising campaigns. They lend their qualities, their inherent qualities, and the photographer and the ad management decide to work with them in some way. Often anonymous people are the models in advertising. So models and actors, performers, corporate clients, athletes, everybody has their picture taken today. Photography revolutionized portraiture. So you're going to go out and shoot some portraits now. Let's talk about some rules or guidelines rather. First, put your subject at ease. Then carefully select your background and control the lighting. Let's look at them one at a time. Put your subject at ease. So you do that by preparing the camera and the set before the subject arrives. Nothing like moving around and trying to figure things out while the subject's standing there looking at you. Eliminate distractions that could upset the mood. Maybe there's two giggly girls, you have to separate them. Get them separated one from the other to get the mood back into what you're after. Create a rapport with the subject. Strike up a conversation. Props. The typical portrait studio has props, including chairs. Notice the gentleman leaning up against a chair. Let him do that for a while. He'll get relaxed. He'll move around the chair. He'll play with it. Then you slowly get the chair away from him. And then he's comfortable in front of the camera. Same with a mirror. That's very important to have a mirror in a portrait studio. The first thing you think about is how do I look when a camera's put on you? So show your sitter with a mirror that they look all right. Poses should be dynamic and natural. The one on the right seems to be natural, and there's a diagonal going on in the composition. The one on the left, she seems a little bit forced. In fact, her smile's a little bit forced in some ways, but she's put it 90 degrees to us, and then her head is bent to another 90 degrees. We don't often take those kind of poses. Look for natural poses. The one on the right seems a little forced. She's come across as enjoying it, but imagine you've had to lay her down and put her hands across under her chin, have her knees bent. Just a little bit forced for me. The image on the left, as lousy as it is very static. That's one reason I wanted to bring it up to you. It's just this dead-on triangle. She looks beautiful. It's her wedding day. It's a little bit underexposed. She's smiling brightly. But what I like is the background. She's standing up against a washing machine of all things. It looks like a washing machine. Is that her future? Is she marrying the washing machine and all the clutter in the background? We often say smile for the camera or say cheese. Well, try not to do that. Let your sitter smile subtly. Don't have them smile the big toothy grin. A smile of the eyes. Or no smile. Portrait doesn't have to be a big grinning face. In the end, you want to get close. Once you've got a rapport, get as close as you can to fill the camera and get that expression. Next, you want to carefully select your background. When I first saw the picture on the right, I thought bird droppings. I thought, who would pose somebody in front of bird droppings on some kind of sculpture? But then I looked closer and I realized it's water, drips of water, drops of water falling. Still, the background isn't very pleasing in that photograph. It still reminds me of bird droppings, even though I know what it is. How about the woman who's looking back at us with this expression of exhaustion? I can see where the photographer was headed with the background. Pillows, setting up all these pillows while she's sitting waiting for him. But then the pillows run out. Then what? So portrait photography takes advantage of depth of field. Notice in the picture on the left how the portrait sitter and the background are pretty much equivalent in terms of focus. But if you defocus, you reduce the depth of field by opening up the aperture. Suddenly she's lifted up off the background. And lenses are important to portrait photography. They can distort the face. Sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. You want to control the lighting when you shoot a portrait. When you're under one light source, it can be pretty harsh lighting. So you bring a bounce card in to reduce the shadow on one side of the face. Notice in the last picture, you see the lamp that's lighting her, and then a big white card that's reflecting the light back onto the other side of her face. It's reducing the shadow, not completely eliminating it. Using window light is a nice, easy thing to do in portraiture. Sometimes you might have to use a reflector to bounce light into the shadows that are created. Let's look at a typical studio light setup. When you light properly, you get a well-defined subject. So first you position the key light. It determines the shape and the positions of the shadows and highlights on the subject. The shadow's kind of going down at 4 o'clock. It's a little bit long. Then you add a fill light. What it does is reduce those contrasty shadows that the key light produces, but doesn't eliminate the shadows. Notice it's bounced off of a card. That red arrow's pointing to the fill light, and a card is bouncing the light back onto the other side of the woman's face. A backlight can illuminate the background and lift the subject off the background. And finally, a spotlight here is added to highlight the hair. Here you can see the 4 changes that occur as you add light. First you start with the key, then you add fill, you add backlight, and you add a spotlight. Finally, take at least 36,000. We'll take at least 36 photographs, which is in the old days a roll of film. For your formal portraits, try to do this. Position your subject at a slight angle to the camera so that one shoulder is a little bit closer than the other. It creates a dynamic diagonal line. They're kind of receding into the picture a little bit. Mug shots have them straight on, straight forward, both shoulders equal. You don't want to have that because it'll look like a mug shot. Avoid keystoning. What that means is to keep the camera straight. Keystoning comes from the idea of the keystone in an arch, the shape of it. When you start pointing the camera up or down, straight lines start to converge. So the woman, or the girl rather, pictured here, has a big bobblehead, and the rest of her body kind of tapers down. So when you're shooting down on somebody, you get that kind of keystone effect, which could be unflattering. So here's a website called stnphotography.com. On it they have some tips in dealing with people issues. We all know that our faces aren't perfectly symmetrical. No part of us is perfectly symmetrical. Take a look at different sized eyes in the model issue. Largest eye away creates an evening effect. Large ears says three-quarter pose. You can look up what that means. Eyeglass wearers shoot with empty frames. Sometimes the glasses enlarge the eyes, distort the eyes, or they reflect lights. So look into that if you want to. So the three broad categories: photography, art, advertising, photojournalism. In which category does portraiture fit? Right, all three of them. Here's the idea of news story or documentary. Rene Magritte was a surrealist artist at the time of Dali, and here Woollett created this excellent photograph of him standing in front of one of his paintings. And finally, art. Here's a portrait of somebody's chin from below. Art stretches the limits of portraiture. Let's take a look at some portraits, and what can you tell about this guy? What can you say about this guy from the photograph? He's actually a shipping magnate. He's the owner of a giant shipping line circa 1850, and those are giant shipping chains behind him, anchor chains. And here he is with his cocky attitude. He's got the style of the day, the stove-top hat, a cigar coming out of his mouth, cocky kind of pose, watch fob and chain. Says a lot about him as being powerful. What do symbols that, or other chains that size, symbolize? Power. What can you say about the folks in this photograph? They're wealthy. They're rich. They're in a wealthy neighborhood. They're wearing the latest mink coats, Rolls Royce. You can say that much about them. Who they are, I'm not certain myself. Here's a portrait. What I don't like about it is the background. The photographer didn't take time to move her over to a background that doesn't tell a story behind her, or doesn't have things behind her that could tell a story. In this photograph, I see that ladder, and while she's posing here, somebody comes and puts the ladder up against the window, and they take the stereo out of the window while she's posing. She's oblivious to it. Pictures tell stories, as bizarre as they are. Where's the photographer in this picture? Definitely, here she got up on something to shoot down at the couple. But imagine, take a look at this picture. You can see the photographer's touch in this picture. The photographer added the diagonal and the composition. But before all that, the photographer had to get this woman to agree to lay down in these leaves. Here she is in her wedding dress. And the photographer said, would you mind, I want to take this picture? So she gets down in the leaves, being all kind of wondering what's going on here. And the dress is all folded out nicely. And then the moment happens when she just forgets about the fact that she's in the leaves. And the two of them lock eyes. And that's when the photographer grabs the scene. And then the photographer can breathe easy. Say, oh, I caught the shot. If the photographer didn't catch that shot, that bride could have been angry with him or her for the rest of the evening. And there could have been some stains on the dress that you could never excuse. But this photograph, so she paid out her inherent qualities when she lost the surroundings in her mind and just concentrated on her husband. Here you can see the photographer in this picture too. Here the photographer has the slant of the horizon line. It looks like the woman's kind of grabbing onto the grass so she doesn't slide out of the picture. The photographer didn't consider where she is in the composition. It's kind of being the fact that it's unbalanced with the horizon line, but she's also not in a good position with the rule of thirds or anything like that. And finally, the photographer, being the amateur that he or she is, left that date stamp on there. So you can see the photographer's touch in a photograph all the time, and portraiture can come through quite stunningly or quite awfully. What can you say about this guy? He's definitely a computer guy, right? AT guy. The photographer is shooting down on this gentleman, kind of diminishes his power. Here's the same guy, Philip Emeagwali. What can you say about him now? Yeah, he's a smart guy. He's got a little more power in his pose. The camera's level with him. It's not looking down at him. He's actually got an artifact of his culture. He's Nigerian. He's got a band of shells around his wrist. He's actually one of the inventors of the supercomputer which led to the internet. If you were given a time life photography assignment to shoot him and portray him as such, what would you do? You certainly wouldn't take a picture like this. You'd probably make him a star, putting lights around him, laser beams, all kinds of things that symbolize what he's about. Here's a portrait that we're involved in. Let's take a look at some professional portrait photographers throughout the years, throughout the ages. Nadar, he was known for his portraits of famous people back in the 1860s, 1870s. Sarah Bernhardt was a famous actress. George Sand was an activist and author. Atget walked around photographing people in the environment, environmental portraiture at its height. He's got about a collection of 10,000 photographs. Arnold Newman photographed documentary style portraiture. Robert Moses, the guy who out on the girder, was in charge of zoning and planning in New York City. He was in charge of the skyline, basically. Here they brought out a girder, gave him the strong pose. He's holding out to some blueprints. Arnold Newman also got some presidential shots. He got close to Eisenhower. Reagan was a little bit standoffish. Gordon Parks, he has an art center named for him at University of Chicago. His most famous photograph, American Gothic. He used the camera to highlight poverty and racism. Look him up. He's a great photographer. Philippe Halsman. Here he's working with Dali. This photograph was one of 36 that they shot. They shot a roll of film, and between each take they had to clean up the studio, get the cats settled back down. Everything was put back into place, and then on 3, the cats were thrown, the water was thrown. Here's some outtakes of that roll of film and some comments written under them. He and Dali got together for a lot of photographs. Philippe Halsman had a long career photographing. He visited with Einstein several times over the years. He also got the scoop on Hepburn when she made the scene. My Fair Lady had just become a box office hit, and everybody wanted to know who she was, where she came from, and what her interests were or are. So he spent the day shooting her, doing her things. Harry Callahan, Midwestern photographer. His wife is as famous as he is, Eleanor Callahan, because she was his model. Look how Margaret Burke White takes this photograph. They look ominous and menacing, dangerous in a way. There's no smile. She's pointing up at them a little bit, giving them some power. Here she shoots straight on, giving a little cozy look to the boy. Walker Evans did something called the Subway Portrait Series. And for several years, he would ride the subway with his camera hidden under a coat, and he would take pictures of the people across from him. He said that this is the only way to get a portrait because when the camera's on and people are aware of it, suddenly they become aware of themselves and they're not natural anymore. Yusef Karsh, he was the painter of light in photography. Look how he uses light. These photographs are like paintings. Look at the smoke coming off of that cigarette. Look how Bogart just pops off the photograph. You could also do it in natural light. Get these pictures of people. Look at the three-dimensionality, the form of these people. That's light playing over them. Annie Leibovitz, she's today's photographer. She shot for Rolling Stone magazine for several decades. Her pictures stir up controversy now and then. She shot a Miley Cyrus picture that stirred the public interest. Miley was half clad and only about 13 or 14 years old. She got the Queen to take off her tiara recently, and that caused a stir. The Queen said, "What do you think this is?" But ultimately, they got a photograph of the Queen without her crown on. So your assignment is to take two portraits, one environmental and one formal. It doesn't have to be of the same person. It could be two completely different people, or if you want to work with the same person, go ahead. In the environmental, the picture has props and an environment that says something about what the person likes or does. And in the formal, you just get a plain background and you're looking for that expression. Shoot lots of pictures. This is not about pets. Don't just shoot pets alone. If somebody needs a pet next to them, that's what they're about. You have the cat lady that has 30 cats. We'll get those cats crawling all around her, crawling all over her. But not just pets alone. You're shooting people for this assignment. Plus, one self-portrait. Here you put the camera on yourself. This is Norman Rockwell doing a self-portrait of a portrait of a portrait. He's even got some painters' self-portraits up there. You see Van Gogh and Dürer. Here's Rubens' self-portrait, painter. Here's Rembrandt, 40 years. He painted self-portraits every now and then. How many of you knew that Uncle Sam was a self-portrait of the artist, James Montgomery Flagg? Here's Andy Warhol, self-portrait. Here's a painter, a self-portrait. Don't simply point and shoot from arm's length. Don't do a selfie. Naturally, you might have to shoot from arm's length, but consider what's behind you, what's all around you, where you are. Surround yourself with things that you love. do the documentary kind of style. If you love bicycles, stand next to a bike. Have that bike prominently in your picture. Or put your head on the spokes of a wheel, or look through the spokes of a wheel to do your selfie. Become creative. Don't just take a selfie from arm's length. Okay, like I said, you might have to use your arm to do a selfie, but pay attention to what's around you, what's in the background, what the story is. You're not just holding a McDonald's cup or there's a McDonald's behind you. Pictures tell stories. Otherwise, you can use the 10-second countdown. Jump in after you push the trigger. Use mirrors, but don't have someone else push the trigger, because then they're in charge. You want to be totally in charge of this picture. Okay, go out and shoot portraits. Have fun.